It was a former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Harold Wilson, who quipped that a week is a long time in politics. The current occupant of that office, Sir Keir Starmer, may well be reflecting that a year, and a bit, is a fathomless eternity. In July 2024, Starmer led the Labour Party to a landslide general election victory. In August 2025, polls suggest that 67% of UK voters disapprove of the government he leads and that only 13% are content. It is doubtless no consolation to Starmer that he is hardly alone in attempting to govern a chronically grumpy people. Across the democratic world in recent years, elections have seen the incumbents slung out far more often than not, and those who succeed them swiftly losing whatever goodwill might have brought them to power. In the United States, President Donald Trump's approval rating lists at 38%. In Japan, Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba can only dream of clearing 30%. In Germany, new Chancellor Friedrich Merz has enjoyed no kind of honeymoon at all. In France, everybody is just furious with everybody, though this does not really count as an exciting new trend. It is, of course, good that people are able to express dissatisfaction with their governments. You don't want to live in a country where they cannot. But how counterproductive and corrosive is it when people rarely express anything but dissatisfaction, especially when the online realm allows any office holder to be berated and insulted all day, every day, by any yahoo who fancies having a pop, many of whom dwell in social media silos which encourage them to blame all their problems, solvable and not, real and imagined, on those in charge. Effective government is difficult, complex, often tedious. Fixing that which is broken is laborious, expensive, and time-consuming. None of it is made any easier or more likely by impatient voters demanding their particular idea of a perfect world right now, ideally at someone else's expense. Has it become impossible for a government or a leader to be genuinely and lastingly popular? If so, why? And how can anyone govern the ungovernable? This is the Foreign Desk.
I think you only have to look at what's happened in the United States. You only have to look at the buzz around someone like Nigel Farage in the UK and see what resonates. And it's plain speaking, it's authenticity, it's breaking up a rule book.
I think that Meloni is running a campaign and now a country on the idea that you can be a populist and you can be mainstream.
Social media amplifies the most negative, disgruntled, aggravated people, and it does create a false sense, I think, among politicians of what the real issues are.
You're listening to The Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Muller. Our first guest is Tom Nichols, staff writer at The Atlantic and author of, among other works, Our Own Worst Enemy, The Assault from Within on Modern Democracy. Tom, let's start with what I guess is the big question. Have governments and political parties actually lost touch with the people, as the people are often fond of complaining, or is it arguably the other way around?
You know, that's an interesting question because often when people say our government doesn't listen to us, my answer is your government listens to you too much. That it tries to give you everything you want and it tries to make sense out of multiple conflicting and contradictory desires. You know, we want to keep out foreign manufacturing, but we want prices to be low. We want interest rates and inflation to be low, but we want there to be a lot of cheap money. Yes, look, governments everywhere are big now because of necessity. They're big. I mean, you can't run a superpower of 350 million people with a handful of guys on a typewriter and a computer. You know, you need large bureaucracies to get things done. I think here in the United States, one solution that would be obvious, but that no one ever embraces because it dilutes the power of both parties, would be to expand the House of Representatives, for example, which hasn't been done in 100 years. I mean, we still have the same number of people in Congress that we had when, you know, the country was half less than half its size. That's just crazy. But I think the distance between people and their government has been shortened by the internet and communications and other things. And that's led to some pretty wacky outcomes, actually. And so I think people should think about whether the government isn't listening to them or if it's just not listening, if it's listening to other people that they don't happen to like, which is another problem.
The social media factor is obviously an important one here, though, and I do sometimes wonder whether this leads both politicians and pundits towards a distorted view of what's actually going on, because is it the case, do you think, that people actually are harder to please than they once were, or do we just hear a lot more from the ones that aren't happy and never would have been?
I think both of those things are true. There is a thing, if I can be all scholarly for a moment,
Please.
There is a thing called hedonic adaptation, which is a tendency for people to become accustomed to their standard of living as kind of the base. So, if you grow up sleeping in a twin bed and then you get a queen bed, everything will always seem small after that, right? You're not going to go back to sleeping in a twin bed, for example. If you're used to steak, you won't eat hamburger. So people's expectations of what government can do have become immense and I think deeply unrealistic. With that said, you're right. Social media amplifies the most negative, disgruntled, aggravated people, and it does create a false sense, I think, among politicians of what the real issues are. Interestingly enough, the last American politician who succeeded, I think, by ignoring social media was Joe Biden, because other Democrats were watching social media and they were trying to hit these moving targets of kind of very niche issues about, student loans or LGBTQ issues or campus speech issues. And that becomes a treadmill for a candidate because those are very specific constituencies that, you're always going to be trading off with other constituencies. And it was interesting to me that Biden in 2020 just kind of, it seems to me anyway, that he sort of just turned off the internet and said, I'm just going to run on, basic kitchen table issues and, sort of democracy issues. And it worked. But I think social media does warp public policy. There's no doubt about it.
Is that impatience we often see expressed by voters, and which is, of course, not to suggest that people do not have reasons to be angry or dissatisfied, a great many people do, but is it just a failure to understand or even accept the reality of how government does actually work, which is usually, when it works at all, extremely slowly and by degree?
Well, the bigger problem is they don't understand how government works at all. The level of civic literacy in this country and here in the United States is astonishingly low. About half of Americans cannot name the three branches of government, executive, legislative, judicial. They just can't. It's a mystery to them. And they will say, my government doesn't listen to me. And you say, well, who's your congressman? I don't know. Who's your senator? No idea. Hold up a picture of the president. You know who this guy is, right? I mean, and I think that's a big problem in our system of government is that people just assume the president is Superman.
But is that anything new, do you think?
Yeah, I think it's always been the case that we have a tendency to treat the president with reverence. Goes all the way back to George Washington, who deserved it. But I think increasingly, as modern society has become more complicated, people just don't have the patience to hear about how a bill becomes law, why you should contact your congressperson, what senators do. They just don't care. And I think some of that, to go back to a global perspective, is the result of high living standards. And people always get mad when I say this because, of course, younger people say, oh, this is the worst time ever and things are terrible. No. As Barack Obama said to a group of European youths about 10 years ago, if you had to pick any time in history to be born, you'd pick now because things are kind of awesome. You will live longer, you will be healthier, and so on. But that means that people also assume that everything's easy. I mean, I try to explain to younger people, getting a COVID vaccine in a year was it was a miracle. I mean, look, I've been a critic of Donald Trump, but that's the one thing he did right, was set up this kind of government industry scientific partnership, and people got a vaccine within a year. And my daughter, other young kids I know, I'm like, do you understand? They're like, their answer is like, what took so long? And I don't think you can I just don't think you can get around that. I'm going to steal a great line from my colleague, David Frum, who said he was riffing, I think it was Peter Thiel's comment about flying cars. We were promised flying cars and all we got were 150 characters on Twitter. But as David puts it, we were promised flying cars, and what I got was a device in my pocket that carries all of the world's libraries and the ability to talk to my grandchildren halfway around the world anytime I want. It's pretty amazing stuff, and I think people have just gotten used to it.
Well, just as a final thought then, as it were, a thought experiment, if you will, what would happen if a putative candidate in the 2028 US presidential election, assuming you had one, stood up and said, look, we'll do our best, but none of this stuff is easy. In the meantime, count your blessings and quit whining, and maybe even ask not what your country can do for you, etc.?
I think he would be one of the most popular pundits on the 2029 television circuit after a resounding defeat. Jimmy Carter tried that, and he didn't do it well because Jimmy Carter was such a dour kind of Sunday schooler guy. But he did go on television and say, listen, this crisis we're going through is a spiritual crisis. He never used the word malaise, but he said, this is something we all have to shoulder. And people said, wow, we can't get you out of here fast enough. And, it just rarely works when the president or elected officials turn to the people and say, you've got to do your part here. I would love to see it. And I would love to see both candidates return to that. But, I wonder even in Great Britain or anywhere else, I think it was Macmillan who said, our people have never had it better. And, we still remember that comment because it's still so roundly criticized, even though it was obviously true.
That was Tom Nichols, staff writer for The Atlantic and author of Our Own Worst Enemy, The Assault from Within on Modern Democracy. Tom, thanks as always for joining us. You're listening to The Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Muller. Our next guest is Lance Price, who was Deputy Director, later Director of Communications for former UK Prime Minister Tony Blair. He is now Chief of Staff to Kim Leadbeater, Labour MP for Batley and Spen. Lance, first of all, let's go back to the late 1990s and memories of the United Kingdom having an actually genuinely popular Prime Minister. If you had a Tony Blair-esque figure at the front of any given party now, somebody who was an obviously charismatic and able communicator, etc., would that be as popular now as it seemed to be then?
Well, I think some of those things would work now and others wouldn't. So, as you say, having a very personable character as your party leader who's an excellent communicator, very eloquent, very good at expressing where he wants to take both his own party and the country is an enormous asset. But back then, and it does feel like a very, very long time ago now, of course, it was possible to have a conversation, if you like, with the nation that was a bit more grown up than we can have now. And the short and simple and obvious answer to why that is because it was pre-social media. So the conversation that was conducted was largely either through the written press, which then as now was sometimes grown up and sometimes less so, and also through the broadcast media, but very rarely or to a very, very small extent through nascent social media in those days. And I think that probably is the biggest difference between then and now. And also, I just feel that as a society, we've changed.
And do you think, though, that change has been to any extent driven or catalysed by social media?
Oh, very much so. Very, very much so. I think attention spans are shorter, considerably shorter. People are looking for quick and easy answers in the way that they didn't before. And there are a variety of snake oil salespeople on social media, and some of them find their way into politics as well, who seek to take advantage of that social media environment and provide easy answers. And I think what people forget, the general public forget too easily if they're not careful, is that government is very difficult, and that difficult problems don't get quick and easy solutions, and people who promise them are probably not being entirely honest with you. And this is something you see certainly across Europe, and I think probably across the world, that people are more and more impatient with governments that they elect, sometimes with big majorities, as they just have done recently in the United Kingdom, very impatient to see results quickly, and if they don't, to register their disapproval through the opinion polls or local elections or whatever else it might be, and to look for solutions elsewhere.
Because how much more difficult does that make governing, though? Because I think it's important to stress that popularity in politics, it's not necessarily an entirely superficial thing, is it? Doubtless many politicians do have a yearning to be liked, which is why they went into politics. But if you are perceived as popular, it is actually easier to get things done, isn't it?
It's easier to get things done because people will cut you a bit of slack. And if you do hit a rough patch, you've got a bit of goodwill in the bank, if you like, to help carry you through that. And, we shouldn't look back to Tony Blair's premiership and think that it was all an easy ride. It wasn't. I mean, there were all sorts of problems that came along, and he made some difficult decisions and unpopular decisions. But he had that bank of goodwill from the populace, I think, as a result of the election in 1997, which translated into a majority of pretty much the same size 4 years later, which is unheard of, and I think probably these days undeliverable. I just think I don't think it would matter how good a communicator you were and how much good fortune you had politically. And as I say, I don't think the government that we have at the moment has got that array of good fortune that Blair enjoyed, would be able to repeat that trick.
I mean, it is obviously the case that sometimes politicians deserve to be unpopular and deserve to be disliked. But that notwithstanding, what's been your observation of how it affects them personally and perhaps even affects their ability to do their job if they get to a place where they just feel like nobody likes them and no one's listening to them?
Well, I think the way in which Keir Starmer, the current British Prime Minister, has responded to that is in part a reflection of his own personality, but also in part a reflection of what he perceives as the political and media environment that he's operating within, whereby it's not in his instinct to go courting popularity left, right and centre the whole time and consider that the most important thing. But also, if it were what he wanted to do, he would find that enormously frustrating, would probably spend a lot of his time banging his head against a brick wall. So his attitude, and I think he's right about this, and it's true of all governments everywhere, you will get popularity back, or you'll retain popularity if you deliver on what people thought that they had elected you to do. Now, we're taking a historical perspective here, so I won't apologise for constantly referring back to the late 90s when I worked for Tony Blair. But back then, we had a growing economy. We'd inherited a pretty good economy. It continued to grow. There was money to spend. We could deliver fairly quickly on things that immediately made a difference to people's lives, and they could see the change that they had voted for. And the international environment, while that's never completely risk-free and easy to navigate, was completely different. We are now in a situation where the economy isn't growing, or growing very slowly so far. The international environment is very, very difficult indeed, and extremely challenging for any government of any stripe. And so it's much harder to deliver quick wins. And while successful government isn't about a series of quick wins, you could do with a few of them just to keep people engaged and retain their trust that actually you're going to be able to solve the more difficult and intractable problems over a longer period of time.
Do you think, though, that even if such propitious circumstances were created again, and you are quite right, it was a good time to win an election, 1997, that it's still possible, given everything else we've talked about, for a leader of a country like the United Kingdom to be thought of as genuinely popular again? Or are future prime ministers of this country just going to have to figure out a way of governing in the face of widespread dislike?
Well, you can be more popular rather than less popular. There's no doubt about that. But if you look back over the prime ministers that we've had since Tony Blair, and I'm not saying Tony Blair went out on a high exactly. I mean, he wasn't the most popular man in the United Kingdom when he stepped down as prime minister. But if you look at the prime ministers we've had since then, quite honestly, every single one of them has failed for one reason or another, and has disappointed both their own supporters, a lot of people in their own parties, and in the country as a whole. So I think the job has become much, much more challenging. It may be that we just haven't had the individuals with the sufficient range of skills and capacity to do the job as well as they could. We've now got somebody who's got a very substantial majority. He's got, another 4 years if he wants it in order to deliver. No one's going to pretend that he's Mr. Charisma, and I don't think he would pretend that himself. But if the key to success is delivery, and he believes it is, and I think in the circumstances that any government anywhere now confronts when they come into power, that is the right assessment, then he's going to have to deliver.
Lance Price, former Director of Communications for Tony Blair, thank you very much for joining us. This is the Foreign Desk on Monocle Radio. Despite the premise of this episode, not quite every government in the democratic world is having to govern over the clamour of an angry mob toting pitchforks at the gates of Parliament. In Italy, Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni is perhaps not actually popular as such, but she's perhaps less unpopular than most. We're joined now by Gianni Riotta, columnist at La Repubblica and director of the Luis Journalism School and owner of a surname suspiciously similar to that possessed by one of the producers of this programme. Gianni, first of all, is it popular to gauge how actually popular a Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni is?
It's easy. She's very popular because when she won the election in 22, her party got 26% of the vote. And in the last Pagnoncelli Ipsos is the best pollster in Italy. In July, she got 28. So not only she didn't lose any training, and she is fantastic, improving, plus 2% in 3 years of being at Palazzo Chigi, the Italian warehouse.
So if we were to ask the people that she's popular with why she's popular, what would their answer be?
She has done whatever she has promised to do. The opposition has been gaining little field so far. Elly Schlein, she leads the Democratic Party, and Giuseppe Conte leads the Five Stars. They've been opposing Meloni, but not proposing something different. And also, honestly, people like Meloni. She's straightforward. She's a friend of Trump, but she doesn't break with von der Leyen and with Europe. And she speaks different language. And she's what she is. And people like that.
Is there any indication that she's won over any people who didn't vote for her or were worried about it? Because certainly when she began to reach a position where it looked like she could be prime minister, there were a lot of concerns about her past. I mean, she has been associated with and indeed a member of outright neo-fascist parties in her past.
Indeed. Problem is that the left propaganda, if you tell Italians that Mussolini and his black shirts are marching in Rome again a century after, they don't see that. President Meloni appoints a lot of people that do not deserve to be appointed, especially in the cultural world. She's appointed figures that have been too conservative for contemporary Italy. But this is not enough to justify the accusation of that she is a fascist again. She's a conservative. She's very conservative on cultural and, identity issues. When I think about family, I think about the gay world, LGBTQ, and she has been very conservative on that. But otherwise, she has been what she promised in the election, and a majority of the people like that.
Because what we're trying to do with this program is try to figure out why it is that almost everybody in democratic countries seems discontent with their governments, and thereby wonder if there's anything that might be done about that. Is there anything that Meloni is doing that leaders or aspiring leaders elsewhere could learn from, or has her success just been very specific to Italy and perhaps very specific to the strain of Italian politics she represents?
This is what the recent cover on Time magazine in the United States that was devoted to Meloni assumed. I think that Meloni, like Bob Kennedy in '68, is running a campaign and now a country on the idea that you can be a populist and you can be mainstream. On odd day, she is a populist. On even day, she is mainstream. And so she gets the angry lady image. At the same time, she is very likable. Recently, she had dinner at the restaurant where I have my office in Rome, and the waiters that do vote for her and waiters that do not vote for her, they were charmed that they posted, glowing pictures with her. I scolded them. It's like, you sold out your identities to the leftist one, but it doesn't work because he's charming.
I mean, do you think this is something that's going to last? Because one of the inbuilt difficulties with running as an outsider populist, if you win office and if you hold office long enough, you become the insider establishment.
3 years ago, when she was elected, I thought that her halo would fade fast. After 3 years, it's clear that I was wrong because she's actually gaining consensus in Italy, and I don't see a leader that can run against her in 2027 and say, I'm better than you and my coalition is stronger than you. Of course, there are two wars going on. President Trump is promoting tariffs that will be painful for Italy, and so 2 years is a very long time in contemporary politics, so we'll see.
Because listeners with long memories will find it perhaps strange that we're talking about an Italian prime minister as relatively solid and relatively popular, because there was a time not all that long ago where, one of the first things you did every morning was not only check the weather, but check who was prime minister of Italy. Was that because nobody liked any of those prime ministers, or was that a fault of the system or a fault of the political culture at the time?
It's kind of subtle because during the Cold War, the American friends, the American journalists would always tease the Italians because they would always change the coalition. But that was like a totally, false image, because one party, the Christian Democratic Party, pretty much ran Italy with its allies from 1945 to 1989. So Italy was a very stable country. And then the prime minister would change, but that didn't really matter. After the end of the Cold War, things changed because there was some stability when Prodi or Berlusconi, left and right, were in charge. Otherwise, in the past few years, the situation has been changing pretty fast. Also, I think that business world likes a stable government, and Meloni can deal with them. She's a pragmatic leader, so she asks them, what do you want? And then she tries to make them happy. So yes, but when you travel abroad, the fact that Italy has the first woman prime minister since the country was unified in 1861, and that she's a former fascist, and the government is stable, and no, she's not running black shirts on the streets, it's kind of contradictory proposition to explain.
Gianni Riotta, thank you very much for joining us. You're listening to The Foreign Desk. You're listening to The Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Muller. In this year's Australian federal election, the Labour government of Anthony Albanese was one of few incumbents of recent years who have been permitted another go-round by their voters. Indeed, to the surprise of many, possibly up to and including Anthony Albanese, Labour substantially increased its parliamentary majority. Finally, on today's show, we're joined by Latika Burke, writer-at-large for The Nightly and expert associate at the Australian National University's National Security College. Latika, we're talking about Anthony Albanese and the Australian Labor Party because they bucked a worldwide trend, a centre-left party and the incumbents, and they actually won an election. But did they win that election because people actually like the Prime Minister?
In a short word, no. There were really three things that explain this landslide win. One is Donald Trump, the second is Peter Dutton, and the third is Australia's electoral system, which is compulsory and preferential voting. That means, and this is the most important, a vote never gets wasted and everybody is forced to make a choice. So Peter Dutton, the opposition leader at the time, was a very poor choice, one of the poorest I think the coalition has presented in decades. And he shot himself in the foot virtually every day of the campaign and in the months leading up to it, with very unpopular policies. Donald Trump, at that point in time, was also a pretty scary prospect on the world stage. I think if we had this election now, you'd probably see a reduction of about 10 seats, because at this point in time in the Australian election, Donald Trump announced his Liberation Day tariffs. It crushed the stock market, crushed Australia's superannuational pension funds balances, and that's a big deal in Australia because we have compulsory pension. And he had also, a few weeks prior, torn strips off Volodymyr Zelensky, a wartime hero in Australia. Now, he's a bit pally with Zelensky. The tariffs have abated somewhat, particularly for Australia. We got off very lightly, only the base 10% and, of course, 25% on steel. So I think some of those dynamics would be very different even a few months later. However, the polling suggests that Labor's not just keeping its popularity that it experienced at the election, but is actually rising. But we're only 6 months out from that election. You can't really extrapolate that polling to mean anything meaningful for the next election.
You're right to note the quirks of the Australian electoral system, our compulsory vote and our preferential voting system. Does that mean that it's not perhaps as necessary for a Prime Minister to be personally popular in Australia to govern effectively as it is elsewhere?
Yes, and this is where it is down to Anthony Albanese. He's a left-wing leader. In fact, he comes from the left-wing faction. In any other system, he might have turned out to be a Jeremy Corbyn-style or Bernie Sanders-style figure. But in Australia's electoral system, you can only get elected if you're normal. And he has presented his government as very normal, very centrist. That is actually why when Australians are forced to make the choice, because they don't get to decide, I'm not going to turn up today, everyone votes in Australia, they go for the most normal option. And at this last election, he was the most normal option.
We are discussing in this program generally whether it is possible for prime ministers or leaders of democratic countries to be actually popular in a way that possibly a few of our listeners can remember that they seemed to be in the 80s and 90s. And I am old enough to remember, I think the first vote I ever cast was for Bob Hawke to continue with what he was doing, a Labor Prime Minister of Australia who was genuinely very popular, I think. Does that seem like something to you that is still possible? Have we had anybody thought of as that popular since?
Probably 2007. So we are actually now going back quite a while when Kevin Rudd, a Labor leader, ousted a 4-term Liberal government in John Howard. And that was very much known as a Rudd-slide. Kevin Rudd came to power on the back of a very aged, outdated old government that wasn't progressive on things like reconciliation with Indigenous Australians. It wasn't forward-thinking on climate change and the carbon pricing. And so he really represented, he spoke Mandarin, he represented this new future, this new Asian-oriented economy that Australia, we then thought would traverse. Obviously, things have changed since then, but that is probably the last time a leader in their own right led the movement as opposed to the movement winning it for the leader.
Do you think that is entirely a thing of the past? When you look, I guess, at up-and-coming politicians in Australia on either side of the aisle, do any of them strike you as somebody who may one day be A, Prime Minister, and B, not bitterly resented by a plurality of the population?
Yes. There is one on the opposition side, Andrew Hastie, is a former SAS captain. He is probably the politician that when I write stories about, and he's just an opposition frontbencher, I get the most clicks on. So there's a lot of interest. He has a fairly significant media profile, but he's not out in the media every day. Certainly he's not the opposition leader. He has a very substantial following in the Australian community and a lot of interest. He looks good. He's a family guy. He served his country. There's a huge expectation that if the Liberal Party, which has collapsed, is ever in a position to be electorally viable once more, he might be the guy to take them back into government. On the Labor side, there are plenty of options, but I don't see a huge celebrity cult-like figure on the left, which is kind of interesting in itself. But I don't think that means that modern politics isn't conducive towards a loved leader. I think you only have to look at what's happened in the United States. You only have to look at the buzz around someone like Nigel Farage in the UK and see what resonates. And it's plain speaking, it's authenticity, it's breaking up a rule book. I think that climate exists in Australia. It's just whether someone is daring enough to do it.
But those populist leaders you mentioned, though, their whole thing is to win and succeed by division. I mean, I think it's probably the case, certainly judging by Trump's approval ratings, that more American voters dislike him than like him. And I think Farage, it's possibly, is it not the case that he's one of those people who's very much liked, but by a minority of people?
Yes, although Reform is polling very well. But what I mean to say by that is not that these are examples of loved leaders that Australia can copy, but more look at the infrastructure for how it gets them to positions of popularity and mass appeal. And I do think that those truisms remain regardless of political stripe and regardless of electoral system. I think those conditions exist in Australia. And in fact, I think Australians are yearning for this style of leader. The big dynamic at the last Australian election was, God, these two. Is there anyone else? The cupboard's a bit bare, searching around. Really, is this it? Two blokes going at it, one's a bit more mediocre than the other. So I actually think it's on a lag and the politics is not catching up to where the people are. They do want daring. They do want vision. They do want to feel inspired and they do want to think outside the box.
Latika Burke, thank you for joining us. That's it for this episode of The Foreign Desk. We'll be back next week, and look out for The Foreign Desk Explainer, available every Wednesday. The Foreign Desk was produced by Anita Riota and Lily Austin. Lily also produces The Foreign Desk Explainer. To contact the Foreign Desk team, you can email Anita at aer@monocle.com, and don't forget to subscribe to Monocle Magazine and to our free daily email bulletins by heading to our website at monocle.com. From me, Andrew Muller, thank you very much for listening. Until next time, goodbye.